everybody. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Nicole Feast, and I'm a forest scholar, completing my PhD at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also a resident here at Forest Hall. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the past and present traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Whadjuk Noongar people. It is a privilege to be standing on our land. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our special guests, the Honourable Robert French AM, who is Chancellor of the University of Western Australia and Chair of the Forest Foundation Board of Governors, as well as Professor Peter Greste and also Pnina Levine. It is a pleasure to welcome you all and all who's here today. Here at the Forest Research Foundation, we are delighted to be hosting the Policy Taboo series with the UWA Public Policy Institute. You can see this impressive banner stretched out behind them all. And the focus of today's discussion is on press and academic freedom, which is a topic that our director, Professor James Avenatakis, is particularly focused on. Indeed, James has written about the educational power of discomfort and the importance for universities to be spaces where complex and difficult conversations can be held. I particularly want to welcome Professor Peter Greste, who, while working as a foreign correspondent, spent 400 days in an Egyptian prison when he was arrested on terrorism charges in 2013. After winning his freedom, Peter has become an important voice for press freedom around the world. In recent times, we are seeing academic and journalistic freedom increasingly under threat, with rates of misinformation and censorship on the rise. For example, online intimidation is now a daily occurrence, and in 2022, shockingly, 67 journalists were killed, reversing a 4-year downward trend in such statistics. Academics are also concerned about freedom of speech, and we are seeing regular examples of self-censorship. As a neuropsychologist, I'm interested in understanding the cognitions and emotions that drive human behaviour, and the impact of particular behaviours, including violence and intimidation, on the well-being of others. My research in my PhD specifically aims to enhance outcomes for individuals with brain conditions such as stroke, dementia and schizophrenia through high-quality clinical trial research. As an early career researcher, I have a keen interest in better understanding and navigating the complex dynamics surrounding media and academic freedom so that my research might have real-world impact. So I'm greatly looking forward to tonight's discussion. And just a little bit about the Forest Research Foundation. The foundation was established by Andrew and Nicola Forrest with Australia's largest philanthropic donation, with the aim of attracting and retaining the best emerging researchers in the world. The aim of the foundation is to have a steady state of 60 scholars and fellows, and the primary selection criteria is excellence. That is, there are no predetermined research themes. So most of our researchers live here at Forest Hall. Like Oxford House or Cambridge, we come together to discuss, debate and collaborate. In this way, we are more than about the individual or their research, but the networks we form and the collaborations that follow. The foundation is not content with only supporting 60 researchers here in-house, but rather has ambitious plans to support early career researchers more broadly across the state, as well as shape thought leadership, with today's event being an example of how the foundation aims to do just that. And just finally, before I hand over, as a bit of housekeeping, I wanted to provide a couple of details about the facilities of Forest Hall and the outline of today's event. So firstly, the toilets are located down this hall and just the first corridor on the left. And second, the structure of today's discussion will be a series of short talks by each of our 3 guests, and there'll be an opportunity for questions throughout the discussion, as well as a Q&A of the audience at the end. And with that housekeeping out of the way, thank you so much, and I will pass over to Associate Professor Paul McGinn, Director of the UWA Public Policy Institute.
Welcome everyone to our second Policy Taboos seminar. And this is an idea that James and I came up with earlier in the year when I first met James. And we both kind of share this passion and interest of trying to look at controversial contemporary issues that are kind of, at the front of kind of contemporary debate and discussion. So it's great. This one in particular, academic freedom, is one that's kind of close to my heart because part of the research that I do, which is around kind of things around sex industry and pornography, and kind of questions around that. And I'm kind of thankful that the university has given me the space to be able to do research in that space, although I can't get a grant to do the work. But I don't need a big grant to do that. So it's been great working with James here at the Forest Research Foundation and having that kind of shared interest in things. And it's wonderful to see so many of you coming out tonight to see this event. So I've got a bit of a speech here to kind of run through because I want to kind of set the tone a little bit in a way for our speakers here tonight. So first of all, I just want to kind of acknowledge a number of people who are here tonight, and I've just spotted the first person on my list, and now that he's here, is Professor Tim Culmer, the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor. Afternoon, Tim. And also the DVCR, Anna Nowak. Is Anna lurking in the background somewhere as well? She's supposed to be here, so welcome Anna, wherever you are. And our friends and colleagues from the Forest Foundation, and also Eve Hall and Colin Burnett, who are on the UWA PPI's International Advisory Board. And also I see Ray Da Silva and Mark Tennant are here, so as many of you will know, Ray is the outgoing chair of Academic Board and Mark's the incoming chair of Academic Board, so welcome to you two as well. And also welcome to colleagues from other WA universities who are here. The Forest Foundation is a collaborative enterprise that works with all the universities here in WA. And in setting up this event, we kind of send the invites out to various people around different universities. And it's also good to see some past and colleagues here as well. So welcome everybody. So one of my favourite places on the UWA campus is Winthrop Hall, because our friend Socrates hangs around there, and he sits there reflecting and being reflected upon by the reflections in the reflection pond, just hanging around reflecting. Okay, and I love. I love that statue that's there, and I've used it a number of times on my social media when I've been kind of making comment about the importance of academic freedom. And as you know, Socrates loved an argument, so much so that he got into a lot of trouble for it, and particularly with authorities, because they prefer to have people who were in agreement all the time. So, we might kind of see Socrates as being maybe the first person that was cancelled. Maybe he was at the forefront of cancel culture in a way. And unfortunately, he was cancelled in a very serious way because his trial lasted for one day, and there was no more. But he lives on forever, basically. And within academia, of course, we use the Socratic method quite a lot. It's at the foundation of who we are and what we do and what universities represent. And the Socratic method is based on this idea of argumentative dialogue, basically. That's, I think, at the heart of things. And I think in the first decades of the 20th century, one of the most famous American judges, so it's my nod to Robert French here, Justice Brandeis reworded some of the essence of the Socratic approach when he addressed the issues of falsehoods and fallacies. And Justice Brandeis said, "The remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence." And that really kind of speaks to, I suppose, the essence of what we're here to look at tonight. And in the first decades of this century, freedom of speech, academic freedom, and then broader in terms of press freedom, universities and the media and workplaces everywhere, free speech is a hot topic. It's a contested topic in a kind of both in a positive and a negative way. So universities have been asked to explain themselves. We've been asked to account for the thoughts, ideas, opinions, and positionality of staff and the visitors that we bring on to campus, and often through a kind of a lens of not just critique but of criticism for people who have kind of different ideas or alternative ideas and so forth. And what we will tolerate in that space. So, as many of you know, in 2014, the University of Chicago developed what are known as the Chicago Principles, based on a commitment to, quote, free, robust and uninhibited debate on universities. And I'm a supporter of that principle and idea. And in Australia we have what is known as the French Model Code. And here tonight we have Robert French, again, who devised it, and as many as you all know, Robert's our Chancellor. And we also have Pnina Levine, who has been one of the, I suppose, at the forefront of critiquing and analysing that model code through her work, through a legal lens. And so it's great to have you here tonight as well, Pnina. And then we have Professor Peter Greste, who's now an academic, and who has been described as a falsifier of news, damaging to national security, according to the Egyptian government, and apparently a perpetrator of fake news. And was convicted after a 4-month trial and sentenced to 7 years in prison. And Peter was released, I was chatting to him today about this, Peter was released on my birthday. Coincidence? Possibly. So you can thank me for that, Peter. So our panel today will be offering their reflections and insights on academic and media freedom. How free are we in Australia, and how far should freedom go? The second of those questions is an issue for all of us. What can we say? What should we say? And how far can we go when we're discussing things? Perhaps what we're looking to do here is square a virtuous circle. And what I mean by that, if that's not some kind of paradox I'm saying, ideally, especially for the academy and the media, whose speech is produced for a wide audience, we reflect before we speak. We speak with a sense of our responsibilities for the reactions we might create. We listen to those reactions, and then we reflect again. And that's how we make progress. Perhaps I was entirely right. Perhaps I was a little bit wrong. Perhaps I need to use different words next time to get my points across. Perhaps I need to reconsider my position altogether. There's a whole gamut of things that we might run through. If we look at the most striking examples of free speech under threat, we can see the subjects where speech taboos are created, the nature of a human being, climate change, sex and sexuality, and war. These are immensely important issues, and people have a right to feel strongly about them. Ultimately, of course, we have such a great diversity of people in the world today. This means that there is a plethora of attitudes, views, opinions, and positionalities out there. We should expect all types of voices in the real world. We will be offended by some, of course, but we should acknowledge that they will exist. And instead, how do we engage with that in a constructive manner? Will we offend each other? The opinions certainly might offend us. My opinions offend some people, even though I know all of them are completely correct. Until, of course, I change my mind through argumentative dialogue. And minds don't change if issues aren't discussed. What happens to universities if we restrict the number and type of things we can reflect upon openly? What happens to democracies if people learn to be silent or to fake agreement? What festers when dissent is not allowed to be expressed in the marketplace of ideas or in the wider democratic arena? Christopher Hitchens, who loved an argument, and he really loved an argument, asked, "To whom do you award the right to decide which speech is harmful or who is the harmful speaker?" And he quoted Rosa Luxemburg, who also loved an argument. I love an arguer. "Freedom of speech is meaningless unless it means the freedom of a person who thinks differently." So, on that note, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Chancellor Robert French, to give a short overview of his position, his ideas and his insights. And at the end of that short discussion, I've got a question to ask Robert, and we'll run through that process, working across from Robert over to Pnina. So, Robert, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. When I first accepted this invitation, I was told I would be asked to speak for 10 minutes. When I looked at the running sheet, I saw it was 5 minutes. I saw an email from Peter Greste which said we should all have a rant for a few minutes and then get the audience engaged. So what I propose to do is just two things. I'm not going to give a speech about my view of the life of the universe and everything, but what I want to do first of all is to set the frame by something very boring. I'm just going to read to you the definition of academic freedom, which now appears in the Higher Education Support Act, and which informs the policy that universities are required to have under higher education standards as part of their accreditation conditions. And after that, I just want to put out a thought experiment based on an historical reality for discussion down the track. So, let me start off with the academic freedom definition. This emerged from the Model Code with a little bit of tweaking following some negotiation between Peter Greste and Gareth Evans and myself before it was adopted by the University Chancellor's Council. It was this version that then got into the Act. And the tweaking was to take out a separate reference to freedom of speech, and so we make sure that freedom of speech as a general concept is not conflated with academic freedom as an institutional concept. So it means the following. A, the freedom of academic staff to teach, discuss and research and to disseminate and publish the results of their research. B, the freedom of academic staff and students to engage in intellectual inquiry, to express their opinions and beliefs, and to contribute to public debate in relation to their subjects of study and research. So this isn't public debate at large, this is in relation to their subjects of study and research. The freedom of academic staff and students to express their opinions in relation to the higher education provider in which they work or enroll. This is known as the freedom of intramural criticism, or otherwise dumping on the administration. The freedom of academic staff to participate in professional or representative academic bodies. E, the freedom of students to participate in student societies and associations. And F, the autonomy of the higher education provider in relation to the choice of academic courses and offerings, the ways in which they are taught, and the choices of research activities and the ways in which they are conducted. And you can see already in that there's the institutional versus individual tension and balance that has to be worked out. So that's the definition of academic freedom, which is now applicable to Australian universities. The thought experiment I have is a very simple one. Let us imagine a distinguished professor of psychology who conducts a series of IQ tests on black Americans and white Americans, and says the results of the test show that the IQ of black Americans on average is less than that of white Americans, and that this is to be explained by genetic differences. What do you do? This statement is obviously manna from heaven for racists. It's potentially harmful. Does the university at which this person works shut him down? How does it react? The case is not an imaginary thought experiment. That was Professor Isaac in 1971, and a not inconsequential academic. So all I want to do is put that out as the beginning of a discussion about how you deal with a difficult truth. Now, the truth is, he did the tests. The truth is, those are the results. How far does that truth go? Is there some other truth behind it? Of course there was, as subsequent research found. Different variables, socioeconomic differences, and in the event, subsequent exploration effectively discredited the significance of genetic differences, even if you get to a genetic definition of race, which is a problem we have talked about in recent times. Anyway, that's all I'll say.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So I don't know if Elliot Handrio is in the room by any chance. Elliot, so I have your question. I'm just going to read it out, so it's just easier. Just to keep the control, okay? So welcome and thank you for the question. Okay. So Robert, Elliot's question was, do you believe Australia has entered a post-truth era? And if yes, what could we do about it as scientists? And I'll just add in brackets, and social scientists.
Yes.
And lawyers.
And lawyers.
Well, you start with the question that Pilate asked, what is truth? And the problem we have is that the concept of truth has been smeared out in a way that allows a lot of debate to occur about truth. There's Meghan Markle's My Truth, for example. There are people who speak of speaking truth to power. What are they actually talking about when they talk about truth to power? Usually what they're speaking about is their own very strongly held views, which are not of a factual character, they're of a normative character. So we're seeing the term truth itself being misused. What we are seeing, of course, in the mainstream media, I read in the morning, I'll skim online The Australian, in the Financial Review, in the Guardian, the ABC News, and maybe the SMH, and then I'll do the Wordle. Just to make sure the neurons are still. But each of these presents a different picture. You can look at the Australian, you'll see, it's sort of centre-right, they call it. They occasionally put in other views, but the selection of the news stories pretty clearly reflect a certain approach. Similarly, with the Guardian, the Financial Review, I think, tends to be more centre. But each of them reflects a particular worldview. And if you make the mistake after having published a piece in the Australian, as I did on The Voice, of looking at the comments, you suddenly find yourself in a silo of people saying exactly the same thing to each other. And so they have a particular constructed view of the world, which is, I hate to use this word, their truth. So I think from the scientific point of view, we need to try and get back to the notion of some idea of factual truth, that there are things we observe, there are things we infer, things we observe, and we're not helped by the quantum physicists, because everything is so uncertain. Leonard Susskind, who's a famous American physicist, said, and I'm paraphrasing him, he said, the way physics is going, reality is a thing we're going to have to lose. Too much baggage.
I'm just looking for the physicist in the room. the nervous reaction. So,
and we have been, can I just mention that I'm a member of the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science of the International Science Council, and we have been drafting principles of freedom and responsibility in science, and also the notion of the right to science. And one of the things we've had a great debate about is what is science? What is the definition of science? And some people want to have indigenous knowledges included, and then that gets a pushback from other people saying this isn't real science, and other people say we're Western colonising scientists, So it's a difficult area, but I do think there is still a real notion of facts, things observed, inferences drawn.
thanks, Robert. So along with not having won a national competitive grant yet, I have never done Wordle either.
You're missing out.
I'm missing out. So maybe I'll start it now. So now I'd like to kind of invite Peter Greste to the imaginary podium. Peter, so over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And it's a fantastic honour to be here, particularly sandwiched between two such eminent legal minds. Well, I've got to admit, just touch of nervousness the last time I was in a room with a judge and a lawyer. I think there are a couple of things that have already been mentioned that I think support the underlying point that I want to make here this evening. The idea of the educative power of discomfort, I think, is a really useful thing. And I think our reluctance to grapple with discomfort cuts to the core of the issue that I want to draw attention to. First of all, I think Robert also and the kind of definition of academic freedom really speaks to the telos of academic freedom, the reason we have it in the first place. This is true also of media freedom. We're going to be talking, even though these are two different things, I think there are very powerful parallels that exist between them. Each of these things exists for a particular purpose. In a lot of the debates around academic freedom and media freedom, we tend to lose sight of why we have it there. Academic freedom, I think, is more rigorously defined and understood as the contest of ideas, the analysis of data, and so on, as debates and conversation founded in in scientific and academic rigour. We understand what those things are, and the results of the conversations that come out of those tightly constrained debates have meaning and value because they're conducted within those boundaries. If we step outside of them, we start getting involved in the kinds of debates that we might have in a campus bar. That is freedom, we need to protect that, but that is different from academic freedom. If we get distracted by those things, then I think we lose the value of the thing we're trying to protect. The same is true of journalism. The reason we have journalism, that phrase that I mentioned a moment ago, speaking truth to power, is something that journalists like to roll out quite a lot. But if we erode the capacity of journalists to interrogate government, to interrogate the powerful, through corrosive national security legislation, which is something we're seeing a lot of, then we lose the value of journalism itself. In journalism, we're seeing, and I think in academic freedom, we're seeing a lot of legislative restrictions. Australia are the world champions when it comes to legislation around national security. We've seen more than 92 separate pieces of national security legislation passed since 9/11, and a lot of it in ways both directly and indirectly limits and corrodes the capacity of journalists to interrogate governments. It exposes journalists' data to overbearing investigation. It exposes journalists' sources to criminal prosecution. In the process, it undermines what we do. But, and this is really the core of the point that I want to make here, there is another problem. The classic definitions of freedom, we speak of positive freedom and negative freedom. Legislation restricts our negative freedom, the freedom from control. But the positive freedom is around the economics of both academic inquiry and media inquiry. The fact is that we've become increasingly seeing universities as businesses, as business units, as academics, as cost centres, as students, as clients. And so academic performance, academic metrics are based on the value that you bring into the university, whether it's through the students, whether it's through the research credits that you get, the research grants that you bring into the university. In journalism, it's increasingly the clicks that you generate from your stories, the subscriptions that you create. What this does is distort the work that we do. It rewards the work that generates income, not the work that creates the tension, the discomfort that we so often need to advance inquiry, to interrogate government. And I think, in a very sinister way, this is undermining the very purpose of academic inquiry, of academic freedom, but also the very function, the very purpose of media freedom. That's something that is worrying me enormously. I know this is a little bit abstract, but I think it is something that we badly need to grapple with. And in a lot of ways, I think it reflects what Robert was saying a moment ago.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And I have a question for you as well. This question is from Miriam Fisher. I know he's in the room there somewhere. There's Miriam there. But I'm just going to read it out for you, Miriam. Okay. Miriam's question, Peter, is: how does Australia rank compared with the rest of the world on media freedom, and what are the biggest reasons for censorship in Australia, and what can we do about them? So 3 easy questions.
Okay, well,
and you've got 30 seconds.
The first is reasonably easy. We rank nowhere near as highly as you might think, but not as bad as you might fear. I think it's probably the glib answer to that. There is the World Press Freedom Rankings that Reporters Without Borders runs every year. In 2018, we reached a high of 18th position in the World Press Freedom Rankings, and then then we had the AFP raids, those infamous raids by the Federal Police in 2019. Journalists from the ABC looking for evidence of the sources to the Afghan files, and they also raided the home of Annika Smethurst, a News Corp journalist who, and they're looking for the source of another story in which she was reporting on plans to expand the capacity of the ASD, the Australian Signals Directorate, with a mandate rather, so that they could spy on domestic communications. As a result of those raids, a lot of people started looking at the Australian legislation. looked at the impact of the raids on journalists and their work. And we slipped from 18th position down to 38th position in the World Press Freedom Rankings. We've recovered slightly last year. I think we're at 28th position, 26th. I'm not entirely sure what the number is right now. But it's still not very good. And it is because of the overbearing national security legislation that I've mentioned, but also the concentration of media ownership in our country, and the power state of the economics of business in Australia, which really, as I said, undercuts the work that journalists do, because it forces you to produce stuff that's commercially valuable rather than editorially sound. The question of censorship, can you just give me that again?
What are the biggest reasons for censorship in Australia, and what can we do about them?
Censorship is a difficult thing to deal with. We have the formal censorship that we have, the legal censorship is very limited. We can't publish stuff around national security. There is a lot of legislation that restricts that, but but most of the censorship happens before anything is published. It's self-censorship. The law works in the way that it's supposed to as a deterrent in a lot of respects, and so there is a lot of reporting that simply doesn't get done because people are afraid of it. But I think there is also, again, censorship of ideas because they don't play to the markets that we are trying to reach. Robert mentioned the Australian and the Guardian. One of the problems that we have is that in the digital world, and a digital world that's driven by algorithms, it makes more economic sense for newspapers to create tribes and feed those tribes with red meat than it does to challenge your readers with things that they might feel uncomfortable with. And that is why the Australian has a much more strident view now than it did, say, 20 years ago. It was always sort of slightly, it was a conservative institution, but now it's become far more strident in its conservative politics and in the opinions of its opinion writers, because it's created a tribe that recognises that there is money in that. The same way that the Guardian takes a much more polarised left-wing view, because there is value in creating a market and feeding that market. And I think that has that is a form of censorship because of the way that it creates news that is fed to those particular audiences and readers. But I also think it has a really serious limitation on media freedom itself.
Thanks, Peter. And over to Pnina Levine. So Pnina,
yes,
the floor is yours.
Look, I must admit that I thought this was going to be a much more formal forum. So I have written a speech. So I hope you all will humour me by allowing me to actually read my speech as opposed to just going on a 5-minute rant. Okay, so first I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I would also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And secondly, I just want to say how honoured I am to have been asked to speak here today with the former Chief Justice of the High Court and Chancellor of UWA, the Honourable Mr Robert French, and Professor Peter Greste. So I am currently undertaking a PhD at Curtin University, and the topic, as Paul mentioned earlier, relates to the effect of Robert French's model code for the protection of free speech and academic freedom. And as I mentioned at a Law Society event last year, in researching this topic, the review conducted by Mr French in relation to free speech and academic freedom on campuses and the resulting model code have become somewhat of a Bible for the purposes of my research, and they are worthy of being seen in this way. So my research considers, number one, what more is required for the model code to adequately serve its purpose, and number two, some potentially unintended and undesirable consequences of the model code and how the model code might be amended to address these consequences. Now, I should say that I too completely accept the significance of a freedom being accorded to academics, which, as Robert put it in his review, transcends their status as employees due to the distinctive nature of universities being, among other things, for the creation and advancement of knowledge. And many other commentators, and indeed the High Court itself, have elaborated on the significance of academic or intellectual freedom. And in the High Court case of Reed and James Cook University, the High Court considered its justifications to be the search for truth in the contested marketplace of ideas, and referred also to the ethical duty to speak out for what one believes to be true. However, as was referred to earlier, how is this purpose to be achieved in what is referred to as the post-truth era, with universities accepting and even teaching their students that there are multiple truths based on emotion and belief, and that these truths can replace objective facts? So the apparent purpose of academic freedom for many has arguably become a way of asserting their dominant subjective narrative rather than the search for any objective truth. With this in mind, I'd like to share my thoughts in relation to the research I have done into some possible unintended and undesirable consequences of the French Model Code generally, which concern the extent of any limits that should be placed on academic freedom and freedom of speech. Specifically, I have considered whether any right to academic freedom should allow academics to criticise their institution, that intramural criticism, whether or not they have a reasonable basis for doing so. I have suggested that appropriate amendments could be made to the Model Code to, at the very least, include a requirement for those criticising their universities to do so with integrity and accountability in much the same way as is expected under the public interest disclosure legislation. If indeed the purpose of academic freedom is the search for truth, then this should not seem unreasonable. I have also considered the extent to which Australian universities will need to reconsider behavioural standards previously imposed on staff and students to maintain a collegial and supportive learning and working environment in adopting the Model Code. Unfortunately, the lines between, on the one hand, offensive, shocking and insulting speech, which is permitted under the Model Code, and on the other hand, threatening, humiliating or intimidating speech, which would seem, at least in certain circumstances, to be able to be regulated by the Model Code, seem to have become blurred in today's society. This blurring could again be a consequence of the relative post-truth and post-fact world in which we find ourselves and which universities have unfortunately assisted in creating. Many words seem to lack objective meaning today. To explain this a little further, I have adapted an example from Carolyn Evans and Adrian Stone's book, Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech in Australia, to a live issue on campuses today. A classroom debate on Israel in a class regarding international law. One student argues vigorously that Israel has a right to defend itself after a massacre of its civilians and the taking of over 200 of its civilians as hostages, and to destroy Hamas terrorist infrastructure to ensure that they do so. Another student argues that this cannot come at the cost of displacing the Palestinian civilian population or any Palestinian civilian casualties. Some members of the class, including the lecturer, may have strong feelings one way or another on the debate, and some may even be hurt, angered, or offended by one of the arguments. Academic freedom should protect the right of both students to make their case. If the student in favour of Israel defending itself was to use a derogatory slur against their opponent, for example, call them a Hamas terrorist, or if the speaker advocating for Palestinian civilians was to call her opponent a Nazi or worse, I consider that disciplinary action may be appropriate. But this isn't entirely clear from the wording of the Model Code. Specifically, if a lecturer or a student calls another student a Nazi or a Hamas terrorist, is this merely offensive, shocking or insulting, and hence permitted under the code? Or could it reasonably be regarded as threatening, humiliating or intimidating, and therefore possibly able to be regulated under the Model Code? Further, should the subjective intention of the speaker necessarily be determinative of the nature of the speech? Similar uncertainty seems to exist in relation to how a university that respects and upholds the principles of the Model Code should respond if such derogatory slurs, personal attacks, or loud and aggressive arguments are expressed in the university corridors, unrelated to any classroom or academic debate. Similarly, if an academic posts an Israeli flag superimposed with a Nazi swastika for the purposes of teaching a class, Might this be threatening, humiliating, or intimidating to some members of the class? Or is it just offensive, shocking, and insulting? What about if the academic then goes on to post the same infographic on their Twitter and Facebook accounts? Again, is this merely offensive, shocking, or insulting behaviour? Or is it threatening, humiliating, or intimidating? It would seem obvious to me that the effect of using the same infographic can be different depending on the context and the audience at which it is directed. I also do not consider that the subjective intention of a speaker should be determinative of whether their speech is threatening, humiliating, or intimidating. However, this did not seem to be the view of the full federal court in the case of NTEIU and University of Sydney. In that case, the full court